Hey guys, nice to meet you. If there's one thing I can promise is that I won't be as funny as the previous talk. I'm Ron, nice to meet you. I am the CEO and founder of a company called Entitle, which was very recently acquired by BeyondTrust, if you guys are familiar with them. I started my journey in security in the Army. I did cybersecurity research for many years. And I always joke that I was drawn towards access management as the boring part of cybersecurity. And I thought it was interesting to talk about access management today with this crowd because many of the challenges that security teams face when it comes to access control actually originate in the IT and DevOps and how employees get permissions to begin with. And so I'll start a little bit about talking about what are the challenges and why it's important, and we'll segue into a few core simple processes that all of us can deploy inside our companies that are really kind of low-hanging fruit that might make it much simpler to A, automate a lot of the internal work, and B, work with the security team. So two initial questions. Privileged access management. Who's heard that term before? Raise of hands. Decent. And who here has a security team in their company? A CISO? Perfect. Awesome. Cool. I wanted to make sure this was relevant, and so it looks like we're in the right group. So I'll start with giving an example. What's this? It's not a problem. All right. Cool. So one of the reasons that I mentioned access management is kind of the boring part of cybersecurity, but the real core aspect of it is that it's super, super key for organizations. And when you look at what companies are compromised for recently, it's not the next level. Sometimes it's also the next level APT kind of zero-day type attack. But oftentimes it's super boring, simple stuff. It's a reused password. It's someone in DevOps that has super admin somewhere and gets compromised. It's an IT team. It's a customer success team that gets compromised. And so these super boring, simple things end up costing companies billions and billions of dollars. One of the examples that comes to mind recently is Okta. If you guys are familiar with Okta, a company that prides itself on access management had a huge breach that was focused on access management. And so one of the recurring themes that lead to this risk is the fact that obviously companies have many, many, many different permission sets, and most of them aren't used. I'm sure that when you guys all joined a company at one point or another, you kind of, maybe many of you have been working at your company 5, 10, 15 years, no one's ever taken that access away. You just go and you collect it over time. And so much of the permissions that we have as a user, as a credential, aren't actually used by our user. We don't actually need them on a day-to-day basis. And on average, about 1% of the permissions that we have are actually in use. We actually did some research internally in our product. We can kind of overlay what people use versus what they have, and this is one of the statistics that we came to. And so just to give it a kind of a simple, pretty cool example, I think, of a compromise that happened fairly recently, this is Lapsus that compromised Okta. And they spoke about how easy it was. And there are a few core recurring themes that are worth pointing out here. First of all, the breach, in essence, was someone in the customer success team had their password compromised, and every person in the customer success team had access to all of Okta's customer environments. And so all it took was one person in a very large CS org that was compromised, and that Lapsus, the attackers, could now go in and control many, many different customer environments. Ironically, this is, by the way, this is an Okta tile. You can see one of the apps there is called Superhuman, Super User, which is a very funny, not least privileged way to call an application that is its responsibilities to control customer environments. And so basically they went in and they started just changing passwords in different customer environments. This is screenshots that they shared from Cloudflare. If you guys are familiar with Cloudflare, another very large SaaS company. And they went in and they just started changing a bunch of different users in Cloudflare just to basically show the level of control that they had inside Okta's customer environments. And so the question is, and I kind of started out with this, is like, all right, so why do we care? Why is this talk relevant for this forum? And the reality is that access management has two sides to it. There's the governance side, which is kind of what security teams often talk about. It's the retrospective understanding whether or not the permissions are correct or incorrect. Maybe it's compliance driven, right? Maybe one of the main reasons that we actually do this is because the regulator has forced us to do user access reviews, or make sure from a GDPR perspective that the people that have access to this data are vetted, and there's some sort of two-step approval. A lot of these different processes that are sometimes regulatory and sometimes security-driven. But from a actual provisioning perspective, the ones that do the actual work, when someone opens a ticket in ServiceNow or Jira and says, hey, I need access to this table in MongoDB, it's us that do it, right? It's someone that goes into AWS and changes the policy, or goes into a GitLab and changes the ACL and adds a person to a repository. And that manual process leads to a lot of direct challenges for us from a manual perspective, but also from a security perspective in retrospect. And so the question is, what can we do to automate a lot of these processes, A, from kind of simplifying our workload, and B, again, to make sure that from a security perspective, people don't have what they don't need. And I'll take a step back, and before I dive specifically into what we think that could be, what I think that you guys can do inside your companies to simplify this process, I'll talk a little bit about what does the current state look like. And I know there's a mixed crowd here, so for some of you guys this might be super, super obvious, and for some it might be a bit out of, and I'll try to kind of balance the two. But access management, generally cybersecurity, has many, many different acronyms. I don't know if can you guys see? I guess you can't really see the three letters, but there's like IGA, and there's PAM, and there's IDP, and there's MFA, a bunch of different acronyms that end up bogging us down. And so the recurring theme, I kind of want to talk through, what does the actual security stack look like for most companies? Good, that you can see. All right, so IDP is your identity provider. This is the source of truth for who you are and how you authenticate to different systems. And so just to give examples here, vendors, maybe that'll kind of help you place this inside of your organization. Say, oh, I recognize Active Directory. Oh, I recognize CyberArk. A lot of these companies, they're kind of recurring themes of what an identity stack looks like inside companies. So your identity provider is how you authenticate to different applications. The second aspect is the privileged access management solution. And one of the things I want to talk about today is how I spoke over drinks last night with a few people, and one of the recurring things that I heard about was a lot of people migrating from on-prem into cloud. And so I want to talk through how privileged access management has changed when compared between on-prem and cloud. And the last thing is kind of IGA. Remember how we spoke about governance, the retrospective, and so the IGA, identity, governance, administration, right? The retrospective governance, making sure that people only have what they need. So let's talk a little bit about, let's define PAM. What is PAM actually? What is kind of, from a details perspective, what is, when I asked PAM earlier and half of you guys raised your hand, let's take a second to define what PAM is. PAM, first of all, literally is privileged access management, controlling access to privileged resources and accounts. Let's take an example. Remember that customer success team that we spoke about earlier that was compromised? We want to make sure that if you access customer data, that is privileged access. That is access that is very sensitive, and so we want extra governance around who gets that access, because that is more sensitive, that is core to the business. And so when we talk about PAM, we actually kind of include three core aspects. First is the authentication. And again, just to oversimplify for a second, a lot of legacy old applications, you kind of have a username and password, right, that you just log in. The challenge for that for organizations is that you want to make sure that people don't have this secret, this password that they take with them from company to company to company, or kind of is never rotated. And so one of the core aspects of a lot of PAM solutions is what's called the vault. This is where you put the password in a vault, and that password is never available to you. And what you do is you now authenticate, you connect to the vault, and the vault manages your connection onward. And I think this is kind of, that's what you kind of see here in the picture, is basically a way to obfuscate the actual password from your connection. What that actually solves for is the actual authentication, right? We talk about a lot of different aspects, but what we're actually doing is we're changing one authentication method for a different authentication method, a username and password with your Okta login credentials or with your AD credentials. A very popular place this is used in our DevOps world is SSH keys, right? We don't want SSH keys that are kind of saved on my local machine, so I'll put those in a vault. People will authenticate to the vault with their Okta credentials or their AD credentials, and that SSH key will now be used to maintain the session. One of the byproducts of that type of solution is, there are two really powerful byproducts, actually, of that solution. One is that I'm man in the middle from a networking perspective, right? So now, let's say I am the vault. The user is connecting to me. I'm connecting to the application. I am now in line between the user and the resource. And therefore, I can do two things. I can block the user from doing specific things, so basically granular authorization. And I'll give an example. SSH as an example again. User is connecting to me. I'm managing an SSH session with the server. User types in sudo, and I say, I'm not passing that on. I'm in the middle. I'm connecting to the session. You're not allowed to run sudo. I'm not running that on the server. That is something that I can do because I'm in line to the actual command. The other powerful thing that I can do because I'm man in the middle is governance. I know exactly what every user is doing inside the end server because I am in the middle. Everything that the user is doing, I am doing on behalf of them with a different credential. What's powerful about that is now I'm in the middle and I can know exactly who's doing what. And the most powerful kind of popular use case of that is what's called session recording, where I can see exactly what people are doing inside the end application. Now, this is kind of the historic model of how privileged access management has been done across, we spoke about CyberArk and BeyondTrust, right? This is kind of like the classic use case of how PAM solutions look like historically. One of the kind of popular themes here, by the way, is that they're often really hard to deploy, right? As DevOps teams, I'm sure a lot of you have been tasked with rolling this type of solution out inside the company, which is just really painful because you want to make sure that those secrets, those SSH keys that we spoke about as an example, are all centralized in that vault. So let's talk about what's changed. Authentication, when it comes to cloud resources, many different aspects of authentication are actually solved. So for example, in AWS and GCP and Azure, whether you're using a Bastion server or some sort of other authentication method, a lot of these services have already solved the authentication, which allows you to authenticate with your Okta or AD credentials directly to a server. So for example, in AWS, when you go and you want to connect to a bucket, AWS has already wrapped that authentication method where you don't need to use your SSH key. You can use your Google login or your Okta login, excuse me. And so the authentication aspect, I'm not going to say it's a totally solved problem. There are many different use cases where you still want to use your vault. But in many ways, the historic problem of authenticating, needing a person in the middle to authenticate you with your privilege, with your Okta credential, is solved for. You don't really need that anymore. The second thing is the authorization. Now, authorization is still a big problem. How many people have edited or changed or written in AWS policy before? Raise the hands. Cool, decent list. We all know it's a pain, right? That's still really, really hard to do, to define who's allowed to do what inside different servers. So that remains, in my opinion, the biggest challenge when it comes to access management, both from security and an IT DevOps perspective. And the last thing is governance. Remember that session recording that I spoke about earlier? What's powerful about how cloud services have changed governance is that because there's no shared secret, because everyone is authenticating with their actual Okta or AD credential, again, just picking on those as an example for simplicity, what's powerful about that is now the actual cloud service, its audit logs serve as a good enough trail. So CloudTrail, you can see who's connecting to which servers. If you go to the log of the actual MongoDB, for example, session, the actual session log in MongoDB will tell you who's running which queries. And that's super powerful because now instead of having to have a service that is man in the middle from a networking perspective, you can just, by looking at the cloud infrastructure itself, the keys, that the services that AWS and GCP and Azure provide you out of the box, that becomes a powerful enough tool to solve many of the use cases that PAM was looking to solve for in the past. Now, why am I talking about all of this? I'm talking about all of this because when it comes to access management, obviously we want to start with the things that are most privileged, the things that are most key to the business. And naturally, what we are all working on here ends up often being the things that are most core to the business, right? The SSH environment, the things that are downtime from a product perspective, that is the thing that is probably most important to the business. Or the database with my customer data, that is the thing that is most important to the business. And so that responsibility of controlling that data is kind of shared across security and DevOps. And these PAM solutions historically have been known for being really hard to roll out. Now, I mentioned that we were acquired recently by BeyondTrust. Don't tell them I'm telling you guys this because they'll probably be mad that I'm talking about PAM in such a negative way. But basically, my point is that actually when it comes to cloud resources, there are a lot of low-hanging fruits. Basically, just by implementing the out-of-the-box AWS and Azure and GCP tools, you get a lot of the value of PAM services out of the box. So let's talk about, now that we kind of outlined the differences and kind of overall what was PAM historically, what is PAM looking like today, let's talk a little bit about what processes can we implement inside the business today that are kind of low-hanging fruit, that are much easier to do. And number one is self-service access. A lot of you guys, actually, I'll turn the question back to you guys again. How many of you have processed a request for access to something in the last year? Raise your hands. Decent list, decent group. All right, cool. So that request obviously has a lot of different challenges. So one of the biggest things is that who knows what's right? How do I know that I'm giving the actual right things? That, from a DevOps perspective, is not necessarily a technological question. It's just as much a business process question, right? What does this person actually need? The second is that as DevOps or IT, we're not necessarily equipped or empowered to make these right decisions because, again, the question is often a business question. It's not necessarily a technological question. Does this person need it, or what do they actually need to do inside the end system? Someone's requesting, let's take a simple example. Someone's requesting something in Salesforce. Which role do they need in Salesforce? I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. That's a business question just as much as it is a technological question. And the third is that not all access was created equal. And so we talk about privileged access management. There are things that are very, very core to the business, things that are super important, and so we want to be super strict about them. But there are things that aren't. There are things that maybe don't even need to reach our desk. There are things that someone needs an engineer needs read access to a Git repository. Why is that my problem? You can just get it. That's not core to the business. That's not sensitive. Why are we making this a burdened process inside the company? So there's kind of the three core things. Now, there are a lot of, by the way, open source projects that provide the self-service aspect. ServiceNow and Jira have done a lot of the work around this where you can connect your different SaaS applications directly to your ticketing system. And what this allows is it allows the end user to go in and define exactly what they need. So when I mentioned the example of I want access to a specific table in MongoDB, they can just do that directly from Slack or Teams or Jira ServiceNow. Now, a lot of these products already have some sort of process like this in place. The second aspect is, let's go ahead and skip on this. The second aspect is the decentralization. We don't want to be the bottleneck for every change request, every permission change inside the company. And so the idea is how do we delegate that responsibility across to the different business units? Now, again, there are many different ways to do this. Some companies I've seen do it in kind of a Confluence space or an Excel spreadsheet where they define owners. But the overarching theme is to enlist the company into understanding that the ownership, the understanding that the definition of who gets access to what is not only our responsibility, but it's the business unit's responsibility as well. And so, for example, the VP sales maybe should be the one that defines who gets access to what in Salesforce. And the VP R&D maybe is in charge of GitLab, but the back-end team lead is the one that's responsible for the actual back-end repository. So the more you delegate, the less work actually ends up relying on the actual automation work of the DevOps team. It goes back to the example. And the third thing that I wanted to talk about is what I mentioned earlier. Not all access was created equal. And so we have a tendency to try to, and this is kind of, by the way, often a byproduct of just the way that we define things in ServiceNow and Jira, where we create one workflow, and that workflow is kind of right for all the applications. And every time someone wants something, it goes to their manager and then goes to IT. Right? Does that sound familiar? It's kind of a simple workflow. The idea is that probably shouldn't be the case for every different application. Different applications need different processes. There are ones that are more sensitive, therefore we want more governance. And there are places that are less sensitive, we want more automation. And so, again, a lot of these things you can probably do with your existing tool stack where you can just take one more step and think, all right, ask your security team, right? What are the things that are core to the business that we actually care about, and what are the things that we can be more lenient on? And what's powerful about that is it allows us to now focus our efforts on the places that are, focus our efforts on the resources that are very sensitive and that we care about, and let go of the applications that aren't. And so kind of a lot of the things, a very simple, easy place to start is, right, administrative roles in your identity provider, or production resources inside your cloud infrastructure, right? That's very easy to say, all right, this is super privileged. And there are places often that are really easy to define aren't privileged, right? I don't know, who has key card access to the building? That's okay, every employee that is part of the company should have one of those, should have that access. And there's everything in the middle. And everything in the middle, that's where things get more complicated, kind of more naturally. That's just how it is in life, right? The black and the white are easy. The middle is where it's hard. And so we want to have the flexibility to create these policies for everything that's in the middle. And so kind of just to feed in, frankly, this is kind of how we do things at Entitle, both internally and from a product perspective. But just to kind of not be plugging in just how we do things with our product, I'll kind of shoot myself in the foot here and say a lot of these things you can probably implement with your current stack. And the idea is to process a lot of the attributes that you have in your on-call system, in your HRMS, in your training systems, and then create policies based off of that of who gets what, because those attributes now become indicative of your risk profile. And so there are places where you could say, for example, if an engineer wants access to a Git repository, as I mentioned earlier, that's low risk. But if someone in sales wants access to a Git repository, that's probably higher risk. And so being able to define these kind of different levels allows us as DevOps teams to delegate a lot of that responsibility to the actual business units. And I think that brings us to the end. I wanted to keep it short and sweet and talk through different examples of how we can automate. If anyone has an example that they want to share of like what they did internally, I'd be really happy to hear. And if not, then we'll pass it on to the next person.
Well, thanks very much, Ron. That was a brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion.